And our next presentation up is Ann Williams, and she is going to speak on geography-based puzzles.
Hey, Joe, there was an intro you were supposed to read, but we can skip that. First I will share my screen, and then we will move on to talk about puzzles in geography. So, and I think, Conrad, you are the one who's monitoring the chat for this. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So I want to talk about map puzzles today, and I will start with early maps from the mid 1700s and go up through World War I, roughly. And as you know, well, you may not know, initially map puzzles were referred to as dissected maps. And the term jigsaw puzzles really only came into use around 1900. And I'm going to use the term map puzzle and dissected map interchangeably. To start, I'm going to review pre-Civil War puzzles in England and then in the United States. Then I will move on and talk about dissected maps, called a special type of dissected maps called silent teachers that were made in the late 19th century in the United States. So the portrait we have here is shortly after, was made shortly after Spilsbury started making jigsaw puzzles in England in about 1762. Children have assembled jigsaw puzzles since that time, if not before, and they continue today. In the 18th century, these children were the children of very affluent parents. They were expected to rule empires when they grew up, and they needed to know something about geography. They were taught geography in school, but they also had puzzles to play with at home and reinforce that learning. Now, today's children are not destined to rule empires, but they still do map puzzles. Just about every kid in the US, and probably in other countries as well, winds up putting together a map puzzle by the time they're 7 years old. Indeed, even some adults continue to do puzzles. And this is a 20th century puzzle. I'm not going to, it's the only 20th century puzzle I will show. Parr made this puzzle from bakelite, an early form of plastic. And the interesting thing is that you really can't tell which side is up in this puzzle. And the people who bought this puzzle generally used it for bets. So someone would walk into a bar, they'd open the box, they'd show the puzzle to the next person at the bar and say, hey, I bet you can't put the map of the United States together in 15 minutes. You're willing to put down 10 bucks on that. And the sucker would say, oh, I know, I can do that. Very few of them could actually do it. All these sort of rectangular states in the middle of the country are very hard to figure out when there's no picture on them. And as a final trick, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is cut out separately. So it really is 49 pieces for the states that were then there. And so a lot of people made a lot of money on this puzzle. Now, back to back to early map puzzles. Who made them? There were map makers, book publishers, makers of children's games and paper toys, and firms that specialized in map puzzles. The first were made in England and Europe. US production didn't start until after 1800. Now, there is quite a bit of discussion on the other side of the Atlantic about whether the first map puzzles were made in England or in the Netherlands or possibly some other country in Europe. I am leaving that debate to everybody over there, and I hope to get a definitive answer someday. But in the meantime, my impression is that the best evidence is for John Spilsbury, who was a map maker in London, England in the early 1760s. And not only do we have copies of his puzzles still in existence, but we have contemporary documentation. Linda Hannes, who, as far as I know, was the first person to write a scholarly book about the history of jigsaw puzzles on English children's puzzles, published this copy of Spilsbury's trade card from 1766. There is a copy in the archive in London. She also found out quite a bit about Spilsbury's life. He was born in 1739. At the age of 14, he was apprenticed to Thomas Jeffreys, who at that time was a cartographer and with the title of Geographer to the King. In the 1760s, Spilsbury went into business for himself in London. He didn't last long. He died before he was 40. Sorry, he died before he was 30. And on his death, a general printer named Woodman and Mutlow, also in London, took over his stock. They sold a few puzzles with their own label after Spilsbury died, but not for long. During the rest of the 18th century, there were two major firms that dominated the production of puzzles and map puzzles in England. The first one I want to mention is William Darton, who and his son and a few other relatives. Excuse me. This is a picture of an somewhat later puzzle, 1814, that is online in the Rumsey collection of maps. And the second firm that I want to mention is John Wallis and his son Edward. They made map puzzles starting in the 1780s and going through until almost mid-century in the 19th century. On the left, we have a map of the United States, circa 1820 by Edward Wallis. And on the right, a somewhat later puzzle by Edward Wallis showing the typical label with Britannia reigning over much of the world. Americans did not have puzzles until, domestically made puzzles until the 1800s. Before that, they had imported some from England, even in colonial times. But domestic manufacturing, America's Industrial Revolution was slower than that in England. The first puzzle that I know of is by Andrew Goodrich of New York City. That doesn't mean he was really the first, because you always get surprised when new things surface. But this is an extant puzzle that is in the New York Public Library's rare book room. It's the only copy I know of. Goodrich was followed by another New York firm, F&R Lockwood, in the 1820s, but as far as I know, there are no Lockwood puzzles still in existence. Thomas Ashe of Philadelphia made puzzles in the 1830s. Again, there's only one that I know of. It's a map of Palestine. If we move into the late 1840s, we have a map by Kelly and Levin of Boston, showing the Western United States. And in 1850, a company near Albany in Watervliet, New York, got into making puzzles. I want to talk a little bit about this one because it's quite unusual. Instead of taking a single piece of wood and gluing a picture onto it and cutting it up, they made a mold for every single county in New York State, and they pressed out the pieces. So the pieces don't quite fit perfectly. The box is also interesting. There's inside the lid is a detailed amount of information about the state of New York, geographical facts, distance between various places, and so on. And then on the back of the box, which I did not show, are testimonials from people like Hamilton Fish, who was then the governor of New York, and Emma Willard, who was a noted educator at that time. She founded the Troy Female Academy, which is, I believe, still going under a different name. Another Philadelphia map maker was S. Augustus Mitchell. He was famous among map collectors for his atlases. This puzzle dates from 1854. The thing I love about it is this inset down in the lower left corner showing all the gold of California. He also, on his map, put the names of all the Native American tribes in the appropriate locations. After the Civil War, we have a few more makers that I just want to mention. Joseph Colton was a famous and long-lived firm in New York City. Colton made a lot of map puzzles. This is one of the deluxe editions. The box, which is on the left, it was made to look like a book. So this is the spine, this is the back of the box, and you could put it on your library shelf and look just like another book. After the Civil War, several game companies emerged and began making map puzzles. Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, and McLaughlin Brothers. This is a very early Milton Bradley map. It's basically 9 huge pieces. Each piece is pockmarked by all these little circles, which indicate major cities and other features of the geography of the United States. It comes with a key and so on. Parker Brothers of Salem, Massachusetts, started up in the 1880s. This was a map that they published in 1890. The way you can tell is that North Dakota and South Dakota are separate states. The Dakota Territory was divided in 1889, but Oklahoma is still labeled Indian Territory. And McLaughlin Brothers was another big game maker and puzzle maker in New York City. The map is very similar to the Parker Brothers map. The box is much more decorative, showing Columbia and teaching a Native American child how to read an atlas. So that's pretty much all I want to say about the early map makers in general. Now I want to move on to talk about silent teacher puzzles, which I've spent quite a bit of time researching. Silent teachers were made beginning around 1877 and going through into the 20th century for a couple of years in upstate New York. These puzzles were produced in large quantities. I would say one turns up on eBay every month, if not more often. There were 6 companies that made silent teachers. I've listed them here. The Union Sectional Map Company, which was in 3 different locations. The Reverend Erastus J. Clemens, also in 3 locations. Clemens' widow, Elizabeth Hartman Clemens, after his death. Charles Hartman, who was Elizabeth Hartman's nephew. And so those firms were all tightly connected. David Wiggins was also connected to Clemens. And there's a 6th company called Tackabury, George and Tackabury, in Canastota, New York, who just might be. I've got a little bit of evidence, but no confirmation. Now, the typical silent teacher dissected map has a map on the front, advertising on the reverse. You can see that the cutting is along the political boundaries, the counties of New York, and they've wrapped green edge paper around the puzzle that shows up on both sides. And they came in a variety of boxes. This box is one of the later boxes. It was on eBay that I got one of the best clues as to the history of Erastus J. Clemens and the silent teachers. A seller of a silent teacher puzzle mentioned this clipping from the 1911 Utica Sunday Tribune. Now, that article was written several years after production of these puzzles ended, and it had quite a few mistakes in it. For instance, claiming that Clemens had invented the jigsaw puzzle in 1877. Nevertheless, it does give some of the basics of the silent teacher story. Clemens began his career as a Methodist clergyman. He left that profession as a young man because of health problems, and looking for a steady income, he went into the map puzzle business. This is a picture of the factory that he later owned near Utica when business was strong enough to require a large building and employees. The article describes Clemens as, quote, a deeply religious man who carried on a vast correspondence with people of all faiths. And it says that his high sense of religious duty led him to add to the educational value of each puzzle with an, quote, uplifting spiritual tract inserted into each puzzle box. As an aside, I've studied about 400 silent teachers. I've never found one with a spiritual tract in it. So let me refer. There are other sources that shed light on Clemens' life, and I want to refer to the map as I discuss them. First of all these places are in central New York, which starts in the south in Norwich, New York, and goes all the way up to the eastern edge of Lake Ontario. Clemens was born in Steuben, New York, which is about 15 miles north of Utica. Utica is more or less the central point in this story. He studied for the ministry at Cazenovia Seminary. Cazenovia is over here to the west. He married Elizabeth Hartman, who was from Boonville, New York, adjacent to Steuben. They had twin daughters in 1874. In 1875, he was the pastor of 2 churches up near Lake Ontario, the Mount Pleasant Methodist Church and the Methodist Church in Amboy, which was 20 miles to the east. I can only imagine what the buggy ride from Mount Pleasant to Amboy was like in the winter, if he had to do both churches on the same day. In 1877, he apparently had moved further to the south to Norwich. And by 1880, he'd moved back close to Utica in Clayville, which is a small village 12 miles south of Utica. Although the article mentions that in 1911 mentions that family members took over the business after Clemens died, it does not elaborate on the several companies that made silent teachers. I think I've pieced together much of that story, but I don't have all the pieces yet. And if anyone knows any more, I'd love to hear about it. The earliest silent teacher puzzles seem to be those made by the Union Sectional Map Company. It was originally located up here in New Haven, and then it moved 75 miles to the south to Norwich. This is a label from an 1877 Union Sectional Map Company puzzle. Now, I want to point out that down here at the bottom, you'll read that it says copyright secured by E.L. Clemens, W.L. Scott, E.J. Clemens, W.L. Scott, and third man, L.C. Hayes. They were all in Norwich at that time. It also says the copyright was secured in 1877. Clemens may have met Hayes in college because Hayes also trained for the ministry at Casanova Seminary. The label, the small print on the label, hails the educational advantages of using a dissected map, and finishes by saying on the at the end of the paragraph, while on the one side it is moral and instructive, on the other it is pleasing and amusing. The puzzle that came in this box shows the United States, and down at the bottom here we have a lot of instruction. There are numerous, maybe 30 different questions about the geographical features of the United States. On the reverse, we have pictures of maps of the world in different, from different perspectives, the hemispheres, the polar regions, and so on. And there are 6 vignettes surrounding the central image. The vignettes don't make much sense to me. One is of Funchal, Morocco, another of, Funchal, Portugal, Tangier, Morocco, and then some generic mountain, desert, and jungle scenes. At the top, we have a condensed history of the world. It starts with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden in the exact year 4004 BC. And it winds up with the voyages of Captain Cook in the 18th century. So this puzzle, I don't think was particularly amusing. It was instructive on both sides. As I said, excuse me, some of the very early silent teachers did not have any instruction on the back. They had different pictures. So this one is a Currier and Ives lithograph on the back. A second puzzle seems to have a section of wallpaper on it. Now, around 1885, Clemens moved, or maybe maybe a little earlier than that, Clemens moved from Norwich up to Clayville. And from that time on, his name was the only one on the box. We never hear anything further about Scott or Hayes. Clemens began distributing his puzzles. First, he expanded the product line to include most of the maps for states east of the Mississippi and above the Mason-Dixon line. He distributed them, among other things, through Selchow and Ryder, which was a game company and a distributor in New York City. this is an ad from the 1885 Selchow and Writer catalog. By this time, almost all of the backs of the Clemens Silent Teacher puzzles had advertising on them. They had advertising by Sherwin-Williams and White sewing machines. Now, coincidentally, both these companies were in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm still trying to figure out if Clemens actually bought these broadsides from Sherwin-Williams and White and pasted them on the back of his maps, or if it went the other way. Did Sherwin-Williams and White pay Clemens to advertise their products on the back of his puzzles? I'm just going to show you quickly a couple of the other images that show up on the backs of Silent Teacher puzzles. So these are some of the later boxes. I particularly like the one on the left because down here at the bottom we see children assembling a map puzzle and a box for Clemens Silent Teacher. The box on the right is a later box, and it shows sort of a baby version of Uncle Sam distributing boxes of puzzles to people representing all the countries of the world in very strong caricatures. Now, as I mentioned, after Clemens died in 1896, his wife took over the business for a couple of years. Then she turned it over to her nephew, Charles Hartman. He continued making puzzles through at least 1905, perhaps as late as 1910. Now, as I mentioned initially, there were two other companies that made Silent Teacher puzzles, both in central New York, and that were either loosely connected to Clemens or perhaps even independent. The first one, this is a map, an advertisement for Hartman puzzles. You can see that by 1900, he'd expanded the product line even more. So he has Western states like Colorado and Iowa. He also has countries like England and Wales and Europe. So back to the David Wiggins, who was the fifth company on the original list. This is a box for from about 1880 for one of his puzzles. And the reason I think there's a connection is that the text here under the logo is almost identical to the text on the on Clemens puzzles. Notice here that it is published by David Wiggins of New Haven, New York, and Clemens lived in New Haven at one time. Wiggins' name appears on the US maps that Clemens published. And it's curious that Wiggins had a big enough business that he had an agent in Chicago, a man named C.A. Warren. I found some information in the census about him. He was in New Haven also in both the 1870 and 1880 censuses, but not after that. So I don't know really what happened to him. The last company is George Tackabury of Canastota, New York. Canastota is right there in central New York, sort of midway between Utica and Casanova. Tackabury's maps have his name on them. They show the time zones of the United States. They don't have any quizzes about geography on them. Over here on the right, there's an inset that lists the names of major countries in the world at the appropriate latitudes. The reason I think there might be, well, Tackabury was also a Casanova Seminary graduate, but he was 20 years older than Clemens. He had a long career publishing atlases in both the United States and Canada. He made his puzzles around 1880. He used 3 brand names. Some were silent teachers, some were kindergarten geographies, and some were called, like this one, Silent Teacher and Kindergarten Geography. He has the same bright green edging paper that Clemens used. His boxes, however, are different. They're completely made of wood. The reason I think there might be some connection between Tackabury and Clemens is that I have seen one puzzle that has a Clemens map on the front and a Tackabury map on the back. So there must have been some kind of business relationship between the two maps. Unfortunately, that puzzle does not have, the original box did not survive for that puzzle. So this is the only information I have. Hope another puzzle will turn up with a box eventually. So I just want to conclude by saying that the Silent Teacher map puzzles achieved wide distribution throughout the United States for 3 decades. They taught geography through play, and they conveyed many of them conveyed commercial messages for Sherwin-Williams paints or light sewing machines as well. The Silent Teacher story is also the history of a set of small businesses in central New York, led by, for the most part, an entrepreneurial clergyman. And finally, I just want to caution that, like all research, this is still in progress and has missing pieces. If you find any of those pieces, I'd love to hear about them. So thank you, and I will ask for any questions and want to acknowledge help from many, many people who contributed information but did not introduce any errors here. So Conrad, what have you got there?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. That's very interesting. I think I and probably many people here are aware that jigsaw puzzles were mostly dissected maps, but I had no idea about the Silent Teacher line and that it had flourished for quite a while in the late 1800s. Well, someone asked, and we have plenty of time. I tried to answer, but I'll let you answer. The first jigsaw puzzles, someone was curious about the fact that map puzzles were cut so long ago. Could you sort of go in, since we do have time, talk a little bit about the origin of jigsaw puzzles in general?
Well, as I said, they started out in Europe. Well, Tom Tyler, the English authority, always said that the first jigsaw puzzle was when someone ripped up a letter, threw it in the wastebasket, and then realized that was a mistake and pieced it back together. But it's clear that the earliest puzzles came from Europe or England, or both simultaneously. And I frankly am not getting into that debate. I'll just leave it to my colleagues over there to resolve it. And once they've done that, I'll be happy to speak further.
Someone asked, how do puzzles of the USA deal with Hawaii?
Well, the puzzles I talked about, there was no Hawaii before. Well, let's see, is that correct? Before World War I, we had acquired the Philippines in the Spanish-American War. So there was usually an inset that showed the Philippines. And there was often an inset that showed Alaska, which was purchased in the 1860s. I'm afraid someone got me on that one because I don't know when the US acquired Hawaii. But for 20th century puzzles, that also appears as an inset, usually to the lower left.
Yeah, so I think the person made that comment when you were showing the par puzzle, which was sort of free form. I grew up as a kid. I had a wooden puzzle with a map of the United States, and but it was in a frame, much like Chris Yates's puzzle. And if you have a frame, then you can have an inset and cut out your Hawaii and your Alaska.
Right. Well, as someone pointed out, Hawaii became a state in 1859. I'm sorry, 1959. I don't know when it became an official territory of the United States. And Mary, maybe you can look that up while we're working on this.
At some point, you quoted a cost or a price. I didn't catch it, but someone asked that she thought that was expensive for that time. Can you comment on that?
Right. One of the boxes had a price of $1 on it. That was very expensive. I don't know exactly what incomes were when the silent teachers were being produced, but I know that in about 1907, the average workman's weekly wage was $5. So if you're talking about shelling out $1 for a toy or learning device, that limits it pretty much to the upper middle class in the United States.
There are map puzzles still being produced today, but do you know if they've been continuously made since the early ones that you showed us?
Oh, sure, definitely. I don't think map puzzles have ever gone out of fashion, and I don't think they ever will. But as I said, except for the PAR puzzle from the 40s, the people who do map puzzles are generally children, or perhaps their parents helping the children. You know, Texas and California are always easy to put in, but you know, when you get to the middle, it can get a little confusing. And
you know, Wyoming and Colorado are almost interchangeable.
Oh yeah, all those rectangular states are very difficult.
Someone found that someone else is making imitation or reproductions of that original Spilsbury puzzle, hand cut out of wood, using the same print, and they pasted a URL to it. People can scroll back and find it. It's actually not
the York Castle in England for a while made a cardboard reproduction of Spilsbury's Europe, but they had the wrong name on it. I think they said it was made by Joseph Spilsbury, maybe one of the more English scholars can. I just don't remember. They did not attribute it to John Spilsbury correctly. I don't know of any other reproductions, but it's in the public domain, so anybody here could easily.
Do you know much about Canadian map puzzles?
I know they exist, but I really have not studied Canadian map puzzles.
All right. Are there any more questions that people have? I'm not seeing any.
Okay.
Conrad, I just submitted one.
The Tackabury map from 1878 has an 1872 copyright date on the scale at the bottom. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, sure. These makers of map puzzles were probably buying the cheapest maps they could find, and they probably bought them in bulk. And they probably did not, when the map changed or a better map came out, they probably did not rush to throw out all the maps they had in their stockroom, and kept using the older maps until they ran out. In fact, many of the silent teachers use maps made by the Colton firm that are overprinted with the Spilsbury, I'm sorry, with the Clemens name. And the maps were all copyrighted, in the 1860s, but they were published later by Colton's children, G.W. and C.B. Colton. in the 1880s. So the date on the map gives you a lower bound, but it doesn't give you the upper bound on when the puzzle could have been made. Joe, could you speak a little bit about the 2004, I'm sorry, 4004 BC date? You once told me something very interesting on that as the date for the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, it was a person, the name Cardinal Usher. And Cardinal Usher, at some point in the 1800s, went through the Bible and tallied up all the, the lifespans of the different people who begat different people and etc. And came up with 4004 BC as the date of the creation of the earth and the existence of the Garden of Eden. And so everything was dated from them. And there are a number of people who have accepted that as gospel truth, and you see that number come up a lot.
Thank you. All right, well, if there's no other questions, I guess we can move on. My job, sorry?
I was just going to do what you were doing, but to make sure my dad is available to give us some closing comments would be great. Thank you very much.
Get back. Well, you're still stopping my video.
All right, well, we can hear you, and then you know where to find the start video button.
You cannot start your video. Someone is blocking me. So I'm not on camera.
All right, hold on. Try this now. Go ahead, try it now. There we go. We see you. You're good. You see yourself?
Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, it's been quite a full day, and I think it shows just how open and sharing the entire Puzzle Parley has been, as I said from the very beginning. The P.G. Elliott set the standard, and I think we've carried forward today. Show and tell, we had, well, let's see if I have this right, Sid Fincher and Sid Chaz Bridge from South Africa, myself, Donna Clem, is that correct? We have from Hungary, Gabos Gonder. Then we had, oh boy, someone talking about her par puzzle, Star. Mark Geis about his historical pastimes. Nancy Herman, Pegasus. Frank, and so then we, then Natasha well, she did not actually say anything, but I think someone may have talked about her puzzles. Chris Yates delivered a great presentation on his BAFTA puzzles, giving away all his trade secrets. Acrylic puzzles, Janelle Emily, Glow Forge laser cutter. That's what I've written down here. It really seems to be quite a remarkable machine. We had the round table in which Conrad and Shay Carmichael is at, Thomas Spencer, Mary Lush, Chris Yates, Joe Seymour. Talked about how they got started, and we talked about dust control and a number of other things. And we ended with Ann Williams, her usual brilliant historical presentation of research on the silent teacher, 6 different related in some way makers over the years, all from the same general area in New York, and over 30 years, I guess they were made. So tomorrow we are going to have, if I have this correct, we're going to have, let's begin at 12:30, casual chat, then 1 o'clock, welcome and introductions, which I'll handle. Then we're going to have photo editing software by Conrad, show and tell, again, Ann Williams running that, intellectual property, Rebecca Tushnet, and watercolors on wood, Janelle is going to talk about that. Roundtable laser cutters. Laser cutters are going to talk about their techniques, etc. tomorrow. Joe's going to lead that discussion. Then the PPE, which is for P.G. Elliott Puzzle Exchange, which should be great because you're going to see some of the best puzzles you've ever seen in your life. So with that, I think I'm finished and I will turn it back to, who is it now?
Chris.
Okay, Joe?
It's
Whoever it
me,
is.
Chris.
Chris, okay. I have to leave now, so I will excuse myself. Okay, Chris?
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that wonderful outro. Let me just make sure everybody can, if people can see me. All right. That looks like I'm there. I really just want to, thank everybody who's attended today. This has exceeded our expectations. The steering committee's put a lot of work into trying to figure out how we could take this wonderful formula we have for making a in-person show and making it something online that everybody would enjoy and have a little bit of everything. So I want to keep it brief, but I just wanted to, thank everybody on the organizing committee, our technical crew, especially Conrad and Joe, and Melinda's does the website, Deb and Roz and Ann and Bob and everybody has done a great job. Thank you so much, Janelle and Shay and Tom and all the other people I'm missing in the show and tell and the round table today. And tomorrow, as you can see on the screen, we've got even more exciting stuff. We're going to have a focus on laser cutting with a roundtable discussion. We're going to be talking about using photo editing software. We're going to be doing watercolors on wood with Janelle, and we're going to even be going behind the scenes into copyright and trademark law with Rebecca Tushnet, a Harvard professor who happens to like puzzles. What a treat. And then we also have show and tell. And as Bob said, the Pagey Elliott Puzzle Exchange, which is going to be a fantastic event. So we really hope you can join us again tomorrow. And I just want to say, we're going to leave the meeting open. After I get done talking, you can feel free to unmute yourself and share your video, and you can talk amongst each other. You can use the chat, obviously, and send private messages to each other if you want to, ping somebody particularly. And Joe and I and Conrad will keep it on, as long as it needs to be, but probably no later than probably 6:30, 7 p.m. Just because we need to take care of other things. So again, that's it. Thanks so much for stopping by the Puzzle Parley.